The hum of Flight 217's engines was ordinary, the kind of steady drone that lulled most passengers into sleepy boredom. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted clouds in molten gold, the kind that made travelers reach for their phones or lean against the window, mesmerized. Inside, the cabin was alive with the low murmur of conversation, the rustle of snacks, the occasional squeal of a child reaching for a dropped toy. No one, not even the flight attendants in their crisply pressed uniforms, suspected anything beyond a routine flight from Chicago to Denver. Except something didn't feel right. Emily Carter, 14, sat in seat 9C, staring at her tablet but not really watching the screen. Her backpack, stuffed with a novel she'd never finish in the time it would take to fly, lay at her feet. She had chosen this window seat weeks ago because she liked the Isle of Clouds, the feeling of watching life pass below as though she were suspended between two worlds. She was a quiet kid, unnoticed, but for the first time in her life, she felt her heart beating a little too fast, a little too loud, as if it were reacting to a warning she couldn't name. Then it hit, the first jolt. A tremor of turbulence rocked the plane, subtle but enough to send a ripple of nervousness through the cabin. Coffee sloshed from cups, trays clattered, and the overhead bins rattled like warning bells. Emily gripped the armrest instinctively, and passengers murmured. The flight attendants smiled politely, but their eyes betrayed them, tension hidden behind a veneer of control. "Just a little bump," one whispered, more to reassure herself than anyone else. The captain's voice, calm and measured in every announcement so far, was absent. That absence created a vacuum that the nervous energy of 100 passengers rushed to fill. Emily could feel it, the way tension can move like liquid through a room. And then she saw him. The cockpit door opened with a slow creak. A man emerged, tall, thin, the edges of his uniform crumpled as though he had been fighting an invisible battle. His eyes darted around the cabin, scanning the rows with a precision that made Emily's stomach tighten. He didn't stop at the front row. He didn't check the aisles. He stopped at row 9. And then he spoke. "Emily." Her head snapped up. Her pulse doubled. She blinked at him, convinced she misheard. But the name hung in the air, sharp and certain, cutting through the murmur of anxious voices. "Emily Carter," the man said again, this time lower, urgent. "We need you." A laugh almost escaped her lips. Surely, he meant someone else. Emily was just a kid. She had never even flown alone before today without her mother fussing over every detail. What could she possibly do on a plane where trained adults with years of experience were supposed to be in command? But the first officer's eyes didn't waver. They were searching for something, for someone, and they had found her. "Come with me," he said. His voice was steady, but the tension beneath it made the cabin feel smaller, tighter, like it was closing around her chest. Passengers turned in unison. Whispers began to snake through the cabin, a rising current of curiosity and fear. Some mouths opened in disbelief, others pressed phones to ears, recording what might be history. No one moved, no one spoke, just watched as a 14-year-old girl was ushered forward by a man who looked like he was seconds away from a breakdown. Emily's legs felt like jelly. Each step toward the cockpit was a battle between instinct and disbelief. Her hand brushed against the backs of seats as though she needed the reassurance of solid contact with the world. The whispers grew louder behind her. "Is she a flight attendant?" someone muttered. "A student pilot?" another guessed. Her heart raced. She tried to remember anything her father had taught her. He was an Air Force pilot, retired, but he had always drilled into her the language of planes, the subtle warnings in dials, the rhythm of controls. She had memorized emergency procedures almost as a game, never imagining she would use them in real life. The cockpit door loomed before her. The first officer held it open, and Emily hesitated. Beyond it, the controls gleamed under a harsh light, switches and levers that spoke a language she only half understood. She wanted to turn back, to retreat to the safety of row 9, to hide behind headphones and a book, but she couldn't. Something in the way the first officer's hand hovered over hers, the desperation in his eyes, told her this was beyond choice. She stepped inside. Immediately, the cabin behind her faded into background noise. The world was reduced to the cockpit, to the sudden chaos she was now a part of. Alarms were blinking, red, urgent, impossible to ignore. The captain leaned against the side, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. His voice came out as a rasp, barely audible over the machine's mechanical chatter. Rudder servo failing can't. The first officer swallowed hard, glancing at Emily. He knows only she. She, Emily whispered, disbelief twisting her stomach into knots. You, he said, simple, unflinching. Her mind raced. This wasn't a drill. The plane wasn't a simulator. People behind her were screaming, crying, clutching loved ones. And now she was expected to do something she had never imagined, save a plane full of strangers. The cockpit felt impossibly small, the controls alien yet familiar. She remembered her father's words during long nights at the simulator. Every switch has a purpose, Sparrow. Remember your training. Never panic. Her throat went dry. Sparrow. The code name her father had given her, one he said would only be used in situations that required absolute trust. She hadn't heard it in years. Yet here it was, echoed by the voice of a stranger who trusted her with their lives. Emily's hands hovered over the controls. She could feel the plane shuddering beneath her fingers, like it sensed her fear. The first officer handed her the checklist with trembling hands. You can do this, he said. And for the first time, Emily felt the weight of those words. Not just a suggestion, not just encouragement, command. Life and death pressed down on her shoulders, and she realized that in that moment, no one else could make the right choice but her. Behind her, passengers didn't know the stakes, but they sensed it. Silence replaced whispers. Phones were lowered. Eyes widened. Flight attendants froze mid-step. A 14-year-old girl, unknown to the world beyond row 9, had just become the linchpin of their survival. Emily took a deep breath. The turbulence outside had not stopped. The engines hummed like a living thing under strain. She felt her father's voice in her mind, clear and certain. Trust the instruments. Trust yourself. Trust the training. And then the first officer spoke again, voice tighter than before. If you make the wrong move, we don't land. Emily swallowed. The words weren't meant to frighten, they were reality. And now there was no turning back. The cabin was watching. The plane was trembling. And a girl in row 9, whose greatest adventure until today had been reading novels and hiding in libraries, was about to take control of Flight 217. Her fingers finally touched the controls. And the plane lurched violently, as though it had been waiting for this moment to remind her of the stakes. Emily Carter, just a kid in row 9, was no longer just a passenger. She was the only hope. The cockpit door closed behind the first officer. The hum of engines, the flashing alarms, the distant screams of passengers, all merged into a single moment. And somewhere deep inside, Emily realized that nothing in her life had prepared her for what came next. The plane was depending on her. The cockpit smelled of fear and recycled air, a metallic tang that made Emily's stomach twist. Every dial, every lever, every blinking red light seemed alive, pulsing like the heartbeat she could feel in her ears. The first officer leaned close, his hand shaking as he adjusted a switch. "We need you to stabilize the rudder, Sparrow," he said. The word hit her like lightning, freezing her in place. Sparrow. The code name she thought she had buried under years of ordinary life, now echoed through the cockpit, calling her into a role she never asked for. I can try," Emily said, voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers hovered, trembling over the controls. She remembered the nights she had spent with her father at his old flight simulator in their basement, the smell of old plastic and coffee, the repetitive drills he had pushed her through. She had memorized procedures that seemed boring then, the checklists that now felt like a lifeline. The first officer glanced at her with a mixture of hope and terror. "The captain, he's unconscious. He can't help us. The plane, if the rudder fails completely, we could roll into a spin. Nobody survives a spin at 30,000 feet." Emily's eyes widened. She had read about spins in flight manuals, had seen them in videos online, but never imagined facing one in real life. Not here, not now, not with everyone counting on her. She swallowed and nodded. "Okay, I remember, I can do this." The plane shuddered violently, throwing the first officer into the side of the cockpit. Emily's hands clenched the yoke instinctively, following the rhythm her father had drilled into her memory. The rudder responded sluggishly, but responded nonetheless. She adjusted, countered, corrected. The red alarms flared brighter with every adjustment, but she persisted. From row 9, she could hear the muffled screams of passengers as turbulence combined with the failing rudder to toss the cabin like a rag doll. A mother clutched her infant, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers she couldn't finish. Teenagers screamed at nothing, gripping seats as if the fabric alone could save them. But Emily blocked it all out. For the first time, there was no fear of the unknown, no worry about being 14, no thought of what she had missed in school or at home. There was only one thing: control. "Check the flaps," the first officer instructed. Emily leaned over, scanning the instruments with desperate eyes. She found the lever, flipped it, and immediately felt the plane respond differently. The nose rose slightly, the wings seemed to steady. The first small victory made her pulse race, a heady mix of terror and adrenaline. Then the alarms changed. The engines coughed, warning lights blinking in a frantic rhythm that sounded almost like a scream. Smoke appeared faintly from a panel on the left, curling like a phantom hand across the dashboard. Emily's breath caught. "Smoke? What does that mean?" she asked, voice trembling. "It means we're losing hydraulic pressure," the first officer said, eyes wide. "We don't have much time. We need to make a decision, divert or risk continuing. You'll have to help me decide." Emily's stomach dropped. Diversion meant a longer flight, higher risk with the failing rudder. Continuing meant flirting with disaster. She remembered what her father said again and again: always calculate the variables. Never let panic decide for you. Her mind raced, numbers and options flashing like strobe lights. "Divert," she said finally, surprising even herself. "We go to the secondary airport, it's safer." The first officer nodded, relief mingling with fear. "Good, I'll handle communication. You focus on the rudder and balance." Emily adjusted the yoke again, matching her actions with the instruments. Outside, clouds churned like storm-tossed seas. Lightning flashed, illuminating the tiny cockpit in stark white. She felt the first real brush with mortality: one wrong move, one miscalculation, and 30,000 feet of metal and human life would become debris. Her hands were shaking, sweat dripping into her eyes. She blinked it away, trying to focus. Then the cockpit door rattled. The captain, pale and barely conscious, moaned something incoherent. Emily realized with a jolt that she had never imagined the responsibility of keeping not just a plane, but a living, breathing human being alive in her hands. The plane lurched again, violently. The rudder responded partially, tilting the aircraft at an alarming angle. Emily countered, her hands moving almost of their own accord, muscles remembering lessons she hadn't consciously thought of in years. The plane stabilized, for a heartbeat, then wavered. "Emily Sparrow, trust your instincts," the first officer whispered. The word again like a lifeline thrown across the void. She nodded. There was no turning back. She gripped the controls tighter, breathing in, exhaling slowly, letting every lesson from the basement simulator, every flight her father had described, flow through her fingers into the plane. Down in the cabin, passengers had begun noticing something extraordinary. The chaos of fear had quieted just slightly, the collective sense of doom replaced with a tense curiosity. Who was that girl in row 9, moving like she knew exactly what she was doing? Who had the courage to stand against a plane that was clearly fighting them at every turn? Emily could hear the first officer issuing commands to ground control. His voice was firm, professional, but there was an edge of panic he could not entirely hide. We're managing a rudder failure, pilot incapacitated, minor hydraulic issues. We require immediate priority landing. Emily's stomach knotted. They were not just flying, they were negotiating survival. Outside, the sky turned from molten gold to threatening gray. Storm clouds amassed ahead, dark and rolling, lightning painting jagged paths toward the horizon. The plane's wings shivered as if aware of the storm's threat. "Adjust pitch by 2 degrees now," Emily barked, surprising herself. The first officer's eyes widened, then he followed her lead. The plane obeyed, responding almost instantly. For a brief, shining moment, it felt as though she had control. She let herself breathe. Then a jolt tore through the cabin, violent and unrelenting. Coffee spilled, phones toppled, passengers screamed as the plane pitched downward unexpectedly. Emily gritted her teeth, hands shaking violently, forcing the rudder and yoke into compliance. The plane leveled barely. "Good," the first officer said, voice strained. "You're doing fine, keep going." Emily's mind raced. Fine felt like death just missed them. She could see the secondary airport's runways blinking faintly on the horizon in the distance. They had a chance, but a precarious one. The storm ahead threatened everything. And the rudder, she could feel it whining under her hands, struggling against failing hydraulics. One more hit, one more gust, and control could be lost. The captain groaned again, barely conscious, reaching a hand toward her. Emily caught it instinctively. "I've got you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him, the plane, or herself. The cockpit door rattled again, as if the plane itself were testing her, daring her to fail. Emily's heart thundered. She thought of her father, the late-night drills, the code name he had given her, the trust implicit in it. She could not fail. Not now. Not when 30,000 feet of screaming metal and terrified lives depended on her. And then, as if mocking her, another jolt, stronger, harsher, throwing the plane into a sharp roll. Emily's knuckles turned white on the controls. The rudder refused to respond fully. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to remember everything she had learned. She adjusted, countered, held her breath. The plane leveled. The first officer exhaled, relief mingling with disbelief. "Sparrow, you just saved us from the first spin, but this isn't over. The storm, it's directly ahead. We're going to have to navigate through it." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Navigate a storm in a failing plane with a nearly unconscious captain behind her. It sounded impossible. Yet, as she looked at the controls, at the blinking warning lights, at the storm looming like a living wall ahead, she realized something terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. They were counting on her. The plane shivered again. Outside, the clouds twisted into monstrous shapes, black and violent, with lightning stabbing through them. The cabin, oblivious to the technical details, was now hanging on an invisible thread of hope. The girl in row 9, just a kid, was about to lead them through the storm. Emily tightened her grip. The first officer fed her instructions, but she could feel intuitively what the plane needed. Each adjustment of the rudder, each flick of the yoke, each breath she held was a conversation between her and the aircraft, a desperate negotiation for survival. And just as she thought she might finally catch her rhythm, a new alarm screamed, a piercing, insistent cry that made her stomach plummet. Smoke. Not just from a panel, smoke from the left engine. Emily's eyes widened. The storm was no longer the enemy. The plane itself was turning against them. She swallowed hard. She had no time to panic. She had a decision to make. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear the faintest whisper of her father's voice, sharp and clear, cutting through fear. "Sparrow, trust yourself." Emily Carter's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the yoke. Smoke curled faintly from the left engine, a sinister gray ribbon winding into the cockpit like a warning. Red alarms screamed in every corner, lights blinking in chaotic patterns that made her eyes water. The first officer leaned over her shoulder, trying to read instruments while muttering technical jargon she barely understood. Hydraulic pressure dropping, rudder partially unresponsive, secondary systems offline. We might lose lift if we don't act fast. Emily's mind raced. The words sounded like a foreign language, but her fingers moved instinctively, guided by hours of drills with her father. Check the stabilizers, trim the rudder, adjust throttle incrementally. She repeated them in her head like a mantra, forcing panic into submission. Outside, the storm loomed closer, dark clouds swirling like an angry ocean. Lightning split the sky in jagged fingers, illuminating the plane's metal frame in stark white flashes. Turbulence shook Flight 217 violently, the wings shivering as if warning her that they were fragile. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You can do this," she whispered, though part of her feared the words were empty hope. The first officer's hand trembled as he adjusted a throttle lever. "Sparrow, you have to stabilize the plane now. We can't risk another spin. If we lose control at this altitude—" He didn't finish. The implications were obvious: death for everyone on board. Emily nodded, focusing entirely on the controls. The yoke felt alive beneath her hands, vibrating with the panic of the engines and the strain of the failing rudder. Every tiny adjustment had to be precise. Every second mattered. A slight overcorrection could send the plane into a deadly spiral. And then the plane lurched. Passengers screamed, tumbling forward in their seats as overhead bins rattled. Emily's stomach flipped. For a terrifying instant she thought she had failed, that the plane was spinning out of control. But she remembered her father's words: "Fear is the enemy of precision." She clenched her jaw and countered the tilt, slowly righting the aircraft. Sweat poured down her face, dripping into her eyes, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't allow herself to falter. The first officer's voice was almost a whisper now. "Good, good, you've got it, just keep it steady." But Emily knew they were far from safe. The smoke from the left engine thickened, curling toward the cockpit vents. A faint chemical smell of burning metal made her cough. She waved at the first officer, signaling she needed a moment, and tried to think clearly. "What now?" she asked, her voice cracking. He swallowed hard, voice strained. We need to jettison fuel. Lighter plane, more control, but we'll have only seconds before the storm hits fully. You'll have to coordinate with me, Sparrow." Emily's eyes widened. Fuel dumping was dangerous. Too much could destabilize them further, too little and they wouldn't make it to the secondary airport. She nodded. "Okay, let's do it." She scanned the instruments, locating the fuel release lever her father had insisted she memorize as part of a just-in-case drill. It wasn't a game anymore. She flipped it carefully, watching gauges respond. The plane shuddered as tons of fuel vented into the sky, the engines groaning under the strain. Lightning illuminated the plane's wings, and she felt an icy shiver run down her spine. And then the rudder started twitching violently. Emily froze for a heartbeat, panic threatening to overtake her. The plane tilted sharply left, the wings scraping turbulence like claws. She adjusted with trembling hands, countering instinct with training. The first officer shouted instructions, but Emily realized she couldn't rely on him alone. She had to feel the plane, predict its movements, and act before the instruments even registered a problem. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She could hear the muffled cries of passengers behind her, the terrified whispers that made her stomach churn, but she blocked it out. The cockpit became a tunnel, a space of intense focus where every decision mattered. Then the smoke thickened, curling toward the controls. Emily coughed, trying not to inhale the acrid fumes. "We're losing pressure," she said, voice tight. "Engines may not hold." The first officer's eyes went wide. "We're losing lift. If we don't descend now, we could stall at 30,000 feet. You have to guide us down, Sparrow." Emily's heart raced. Descend? Into a storm, with failing engines and a trembling rudder. It was madness, But there was no alternative. She squared her shoulders, gritted her teeth, and pushed the yoke forward slowly, carefully controlling the descent. Lightning flashed, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers through the small cockpit windows. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and adjusted the throttle, guiding the aircraft with precision born of instinct and desperate courage. The wings quivered, the plane's metal frame groaned, and the storm seemed to claw at them from every direction. "Brace for turbulence," the first officer shouted. The plane dropped sharply, passengers screamed, and the cabin was thrown into chaos. Coffee cups flew, bags tumbled, and Emily felt herself sliding slightly in the cockpit seat. She gritted her teeth, correcting the tilt, righting the plane again. Another flash of lightning, another shudder through the frame. She could feel the metal complaining, resisting, testing her resolve. Her hands shook, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The first officer looked at her, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Sparrow, if you fail, we're done." Emily nodded, swallowing back tears. "I won't fail," she said, though the words felt fragile, almost impossible. And then she remembered the code name, the reason she had been chosen, Sparrow. Her father had never let her forget it. A sparrow is small, but it survives against the odds. It's clever, adaptable, it finds a way. She took a deep breath, letting that thought steady her hands. The plane lurched again. This time Emily anticipated it, adjusting before the rudder even reacted. She could feel the aircraft responding as if it trusted her instinct more than her hands. The first officer's jaw dropped. I can't believe this," he whispered. She's controlling it." Emily's stomach twisted as she saw the horizon through the cockpit window. The secondary airport was still miles away, partially obscured by the storm, its lights flickering in and out. They had a chance, but the storm was closing in faster than she could calculate. Then a new alarm screamed, a piercing, high-pitched wail. One of the hydraulics failed completely. Emily's chest tightened. The rudder was now almost entirely unresponsive. One misstep, one incorrect adjustment, and the plane could roll at any second. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus. I need the checklist," she said. The first officer handed it over and she scanned it quickly, her eyes moving faster than ever. "Adjust stabilizers. Compensate with flaps. Use engine differential." Every word was a lifeline, every command a heartbeat. The plane tilted sharply to the right. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. She countered immediately, pushing the yoke with every ounce of strength and concentration she could muster. The wings leveled, barely. Passengers behind her were screaming again, but Emily didn't hear them. She only felt the plane, the vibration of the engines, the tension in the controls. She whispered a silent prayer, one she had never said before. "Let us survive this." The first officer's voice broke through. We might just make it, Sparrow, just keep it steady." Emily exhaled slowly, though she knew it was temporary. The storm wasn't over, the engines were failing, and the rudder was almost useless. But for now, for this moment, she had control. And then, as if mocking their effort, a lightning bolt struck a cloud directly ahead, illuminating the runway of the secondary airport in a brilliant, terrifying glare. The storm wasn't just an obstacle anymore. It was a gauntlet, and Flight 217 was entering it at 30,000 feet, guided by a 14-year-old girl who had never asked to be a hero. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The first officer leaned close. "Sparrow, we're counting on you, all of us." Emily's hands tightened around the yoke. She nodded. There was no fear left, only focus. The storm was coming, and she had no choice but to meet it head-on. The plane shuddered violently again. The cabin screamed. Emily Carter, just a kid in row 9, was now the only thing standing between life and disaster. And the next move she made would determine everything. The cockpit was a storm of noise and tension. Alarms screamed like banshees, warning of failing systems and surging hydraulics. Emily Carter's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, sweat dripping down her temples, hair sticking to her forehead. Lightning illuminated the cockpit in stark white flashes, casting twisted shadows across the dials, the first officer's strained face, and the captain, pale and barely conscious, slumped in his seat. Outside, the storm roared like a living creature, a wall of gray and black clouds writhing with violent intent. Every bolt of lightning struck the world around them, a reminder that they were dancing on the edge of disaster. The first officer glanced at her, voice tight. "Sparrow, descent angle is critical. If we miscalculate by even half a degree, we could stall. Are you ready?" Emily nodded, swallowing hard. Ready wasn't the word she felt. Terrified was more accurate, but she pushed it aside, letting muscle memory and instinct take over. She remembered her father's long nights teaching her about controlling an aircraft in extreme situations. Feel the plane, anticipate it, don't fight it, become part of it. The plane shuddered violently, the rudder spasming almost uselessly under her command. She leaned into the controls, countering with precise, trembling movements. Each adjustment had to be exact. Outside, the storm clawed at the fuselage, wind shear slicing across the wings like knives. The plane pitched dangerously, and Emily felt the first real touch of vertigo. "Steady, steady, steady," she whispered to herself, though the words barely penetrated the roar of engines and turbulence. The first officer pointed to a series of instruments. "Altitude dropping too fast. Compensate with engine thrust, careful." Emily's fingers danced over the throttle, adjusting minute increments, feeling the vibrations travel through her hands and into her bones. The plane responded slowly, like a beast resisting submission, but it responded. Another jolt. The cabin behind her shook violently, passengers screaming in terror. The plane tilted sharply to the left. Emily's stomach lurched. "Counter," she shouted instinctively. Her hands twisted the yoke, fighting the rudder's sluggish resistance. Sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging. Lightning flashed again, revealing the terrified faces of passengers pressed against their seats. She focused entirely on the horizon, trying to find any stable point in the chaos. The first officer's voice trembled. "We're entering the worst part of the storm. Turbulence will be extreme. Hold on, hold on." Emily adjusted the flaps, feeling the wings respond with a reluctant obedience. The plane pitched, rose slightly, then began to stabilize. For a heartbeat, she dared to hope. Then the alarms changed. New warnings screamed. Smoke from the left engine thickened, curling ominously into the cockpit. Emily choked back a cough, waving it away as she tried to focus. "Hydraulic pressure is critical," the first officer warned. "We might lose control surfaces. You need to manage without full rudder input." Emily's mind raced. Manage without rudder input. That was impossible, or at least it should have been. She remembered her father's mantra: when the system fails, the pilot becomes the system. She adjusted the yoke, coordinating a delicate balance of ailerons and engine differential to compensate for the failing rudder. The plane tilted violently again. Her stomach flipped. She fought the controls with every ounce of strength, feeling the metal frame groaning under the stress. Lightning struck closer, the flash so bright it left an afterimage in her vision. The plane shuddered violently, the wings twisting, metal screaming under the strain. Emily's hands moved almost of their own accord, precise, controlled, guided by instinct honed from years of simulated emergencies. The first officer watched, awe and terror mingling in his eyes. "Unbelievable," he whispered. "I can't believe she's holding it." Emily didn't answer. There was no time. The storm was relentless, wind shear slicing across the fuselage, rain pelting the windows like bullets. The secondary airport's runway lights flickered faintly through the gray haze, miles away, barely visible. She focused on that point, every ounce of concentration laser-sharp. "Engage flaps to 30 degrees, the first officer instructed. "Prepare for high-speed descent. We need to bleed altitude quickly but controlled. You ready?" Emily's hands tightened around the yoke. She nodded, then whispered almost to herself, "Let's go." The plane dove into the storm, engines roaring, wings buffeted by wind and rain. Lightning cracked dangerously close, illuminating the tiny cockpit and the terror-stricken cabin below. Emily's stomach twisted with fear, but she pushed it aside. Focus, she reminded herself. Focus on the controls. Focus on the plane. Focus on survival. Passengers screamed and clutched their loved ones. Flight attendants tried to maintain composure, but their faces betrayed the terror they felt. Emily could feel their fear through the vibrations of the fuselage. Every shudder, every tilt was a reminder of the stakes. One wrong move, one overcorrection, and 30,000 feet of metal, fuel, and lives could become a catastrophic mess. The plane lurched again, violently pitching to the right. Emily countered, leaning into the controls, sweat streaming down her face. She felt a fleeting sense of connection with the aircraft, an almost symbiotic relationship, as if the plane understood that she was not just a passenger but its pilot, its guide, its hope. "Good, good, Sparrow, keep it steady," the first officer urged, voice tight with tension. Emily exhaled slowly, even as the plane trembled. "Almost there," she whispered, though she knew the secondary airport was still miles away, the storm still raging with full force. A sudden alarm screamed. The left engine was failing entirely. Smoke billowed, thick and acrid, filling the cockpit. Emily gagged but forced herself to continue. She adjusted throttle on the remaining engine, using differential power to maintain stability. The plane tilted dangerously, wings quivering. Hold her steady," the first officer shouted. Emily's hands shook violently, but she forced them to obey. She could feel the plane's resistance, the weight of its metal frame and fuel, the battle against gravity and wind shear. She whispered to herself, "You are the system. You are the plane." Outside, lightning struck, illuminating the runway below for a brief instant. Emily saw the tiny lights of the emergency vehicles, lined up like soldiers awaiting their charge. The sight gave her a spark of hope, but only a spark. The storm was far from over, and Flight 217 was battered, smoking, and fragile. She adjusted the flaps, trimmed the rudder as best she could, and focused on the descent. Each second stretched into an eternity. The plane pitched, yawed, and resisted, but she countered, adjusted, and guided it forward. Sweat stung her eyes, adrenaline coursed through her veins, and fear clawed at the edges of her mind. The first officer leaned over, eyes wide. "Sparrow, if you keep this up, we might just make it, but the landing, prepare yourself. It won't be gentle." Emily nodded, swallowing back nausea and terror. She had faced the impossible and survived, but she knew the worst was yet to come. The storm, the failing engines, the exhausted rudder, they all awaited her in the final approach. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the cockpit, the twisted instruments, and the fragile metal wings. Emily took a deep breath. She would meet the storm. She would land the plane. She would save them. Because at 30,000 feet, with lives hanging by a thread, a kid in row 9 was the only thing standing between Flight 217 and disaster. And the next moment would decide everything. The runway lights of the secondary airport flickered like distant stars struggling against the storm's fury. Emily Carter's fingers burned from gripping the yoke, knuckles white, sweat stinging her eyes. Flight 217 was a wounded beast, shuddering with every gust, wings quivering, engines coughing as the left one struggled to survive. The cabin behind her trembled with terror, muffled cries, whispered prayers, and the sharp clatter of spilled belongings echoed through the fuselage. Every life on board depended on her next move. "Altitude is dropping faster than expected," the first officer shouted. "Prepare for high-speed approach, flaps at 30 degrees, adjust throttle." Emily's eyes darted between the instruments and the faint glow of the runway ahead. Lightning sliced the sky, illuminating the jagged outlines of clouds and turning the horizon into a ghostly maze. Rain pelted the windows like bullets, turning the world outside into a blur. She swallowed hard. Her hands tightened around the controls. Flaps adjusted, rudder barely responsive, engines groaning under the strain. Emily pushed forward carefully, countering the violent pull of wind shear. Her stomach twisted with every movement of the plane, every shudder from the wings. She could feel the weight of the passengers, of the first officer, of the unconscious captain behind her, pressing down like a living force. "Steady," she whispered, repeating the mantra her father had drilled into her. "Steady, trust the plane, trust yourself." The first officer leaned over, pointing at the instruments. "We're going to have to touch down in the storm. Crosswinds are extreme. You must keep her aligned with the runway. Don't overcorrect." Emily nodded, swallowing back fear. Overcorrection could send the plane into a deadly spin. Undercorrection would veer them into a storm-tossed ditch or worse. She scanned the runway lights, gauging distance, wind, and the plane's trembling responses. The storm tore at them, gusts rocking the fuselage, the plane pitching violently, as if testing her resolve. Suddenly, the left engine sputtered, a final cough, and died. Smoke thickened, curling into the cockpit vents. Emily gagged, forcing herself to focus. One engine down, one plane teetering on the brink, and 100 lives depending on her. "Throttle compensate, use differential," she shouted, almost instinctively. The first officer nodded, adjusting the right engine's power as Emily countered with subtle yoke and aileron movements. The plane tilted violently, but she fought it, holding the aircraft steady against the storm. The passengers screamed as turbulence rocked the cabin. Emily blocked it out entirely. She couldn't allow distraction. Every second mattered. Every heartbeat counted. She adjusted trim, recalibrated flaps, and slowly guided the plane closer to the runway. The first officer's voice trembled. "Sparrow, you've got this. Almost there, almost." Emily's heart pounded. She had faced impossible situations in simulators, yes, but this was real. Real metal, real passengers, real death hovering at 30,000 feet. Her vision blurred with sweat and tears, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Lightning cracked directly ahead, illuminating the runway for a fleeting second. Emily's stomach twisted. That single glimpse was both a lifeline and a threat. The storm could swallow the runway in an instant. She adjusted the plane's angle, the yoke responding with a slight delay from the failing rudder. A sudden gust threatened to roll them sideways. She countered with trembling precision. Hold her steady," the first officer shouted. The plane lurched violently, passengers screaming. Emily adjusted flaps, nudged the throttle, and leaned into the yoke with all her strength. Metal groaned. The wings trembled, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment she thought she might fail. Then instinct kicked in. Muscle memory from countless nights with her father's simulator combined with adrenaline guided her hands. She tilted, corrected, compensated. The plane steadied. The first officer's jaw dropped. She's doing it," he muttered, all mingling with terror. But the storm wasn't finished. Lightning struck dangerously close, illuminating the turbulent clouds in strobing white. Rain pelted the windshield, turning visibility into near zero. The plane pitched violently, a sharp dip that sent Emily's stomach into her throat. She countered, heart racing, sweat dripping onto the controls. "Brace for impact," the first officer shouted. "Wind shear, crosswinds, she'll fight you." Emily's mind went completely blank, save for the checklist her father had drilled into her. Flaps, throttle, trim, align with runway, steady, don't panic. She adjusted, the plane responding just enough to keep them aligned. Another gust hit, harder this time, the fuselage shaking like a toy. Passengers screamed, arms flailing. Emily didn't flinch. She was the center of the storm now, the calm in the chaos. "Runway in sight," she shouted, almost to herself. Her eyes locked onto the faint lights emerging through the rain and darkness. The plane responded sluggishly, rudder nearly dead, but she guided it forward inch by inch. The first officer leaned close. "Sparrow, you're going to land her. Are you ready?" Emily nodded, swallowing fear and nausea. She could feel every vibration, every groan of metal, every ounce of the aircraft's strain. The runway lights drew closer, beckoning fragile beacons in the tempest. Her heart hammered. She could almost hear the passengers' prayers, muffled but insistent, threading through the roar of engines and wind. She adjusted flaps to full, checked her alignment again, then began the final descent. The plane pitched violently, caught in a gust, tipping almost to the right. Emily countered, precise and deliberate, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The fuselage groaned, engines strained. "Hold her, just hold her," the first officer shouted. Emily's chest burned. She leaned into the controls, balancing the failing rudder with subtle aileron and engine adjustments. The plane trembled, pitching violently, but she refused to let it roll. Inch by inch, the ground approached. Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating the wet, storm-lashed runway. Emily exhaled slowly. She had stabilized the descent, compensated for crosswinds, and aligned Flight 217 with the runway. But the final challenge remained, the touchdown. One mistake now would undo everything. The first officer's voice was urgent, trembling. "Sparrow, flaps full, throttle steady, you've got this." Emily's hands burned on the controls, sweat stinging her eyes. She leaned forward, focusing entirely on the instruments and runway. The plane trembled violently one last time, wings shivering, metal groaning. And then the wheels touched the tarmac. The fuselage shuddered as tires screeched against wet asphalt. Emily countered the final gust, adjusting throttle and rudder as best she could. The plane skidded, veered slightly, but she held it. Inch by inch, Flight 217 slowed, fighting the storm, obeying the girl in row 9 who had become its unlikely pilot. The first officer exhaled in disbelief. We did it. She landed her." Emily's arms shook violently, but she held the yoke until the plane rolled to a complete stop, tires hissing against the soaked runway. Behind her, passengers erupted in cries of relief and sobs of gratitude. Flight attendants rushed to calm children and reassure terrified travelers. The storm raged around them, but for the first time in hours, Emily felt a glimmer of triumph. She had done it. Against impossible odds, she had guided a failing plane through a storm and brought everyone safely to the ground. And yet, even as relief washed over her, she knew the crisis wasn't fully over. The captain was still unconscious. The left engine smoldered faintly. An emergency cruise surrounded the aircraft, flashing lights cutting through the rain. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with the weight of what she had just accomplished. Emily Carter, just a kid in row 9, had landed Flight 217. But as she released the yoke, trembling, and turned to face the first officer, she saw the raw exhaustion and disbelief etched into his face. "Sparrow, the captain," he said softly. He's not responding. We need to get him immediate attention." Emily swallowed hard. She had saved the plane, saved the passengers, but the fight wasn't over. Someone still needed her help. And for the first time, she realized, even heroes can't rest until everyone is truly safe. Flight 217 had finally stopped. Tires hissed on the wet tarmac, rain streaking across the windows like silver rivers. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their flashing lights reflecting in the puddles, painting the aircraft in surreal reds and blues. Inside the cockpit, Emily Carter's arms trembled as she released the yoke, muscles stiff from hours of unrelenting tension. Her chest heaved, lungs burning, but she couldn't let herself collapse, not yet. The first officer leaned back, his face pale but alive with awe. "Sparrow, you did it. You actually did it." Emily's mouth was dry, her voice barely audible. Is everyone okay?" "Everyone's alive," he replied, almost incredulously. "Because of you." For a fleeting moment, relief washed over her, sharp and dizzying. But then she looked at the captain slumped in his seat. His face was pale, lips unmoving, eyes closed. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had landed the plane, yes, but the man who had trained her father, who had been the true commander, was still in peril. "We need medics in here," the first officer said urgently. "Now." Emily nodded, moving to the captain's side. The smoke from the left engine had mostly dissipated, leaving a faint chemical scent in the cockpit. She knelt beside the man, her hands shaking, unsure how much help she could provide. But she remembered the basics her father had drilled into her for emergencies. Check consciousness, check breathing, check pulse. The captain's pulse was weak, shallow. Emily pressed her fingers against his wrist, feeling the faint flutter of life. "He's alive," she whispered, a small relief in her chest, but it was tempered by the knowledge that time was critical. The cockpit door opened, and emergency medics rushed in, dragging oxygen masks, defibrillators, and first aid equipment. They moved with military precision, assessing the captain's condition in seconds. Emily stepped back, trembling, exhausted, but unable to let go of the situation entirely. She had been in control for hours. The plane had responded to her, and now, even in the hands of trained professionals, she felt a fierce protectiveness over the lives she had saved. One medic looked at her, awe in his eyes. "You landed this plane?" he asked, incredulous. Emily nodded, voice shaking. I had to." The captain groaned faintly as they administered oxygen. Emily felt a small spark of hope. He was responding slowly, his eyes fluttering open. Recognition and confusion mingled on his face as he realized where he was. "Sparrow," he rasped, barely audible. The code name hit Emily like a thunderclap. He knew who she was. "Yes," she whispered, "it's me. I helped land the plane." Tears welled in his eyes, faint but unmistakable. "Your father, he trained you well," he said, voice weak but filled with awe. "You saved everyone." The first officer exhaled, relief flooding his features. "I can't believe it, she actually did it. She's a hero." Emily's knees weakened, and she sank into the co-pilot's seat for support. The adrenaline that had fueled her for hours began to fade, leaving a hollow exhaustion that pressed on her chest like a weight. Her hands were still shaking, sweat and rain dripping into her eyes, but there was also an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, of impossible courage realized in the moment of crisis. Outside the plane, emergency crews moved swiftly, directing passengers off the aircraft. Emily watched as families embraced, sobbing and clinging to one another. The world beyond the cockpit felt surreal, almost dreamlike. She had flown into a storm, guided a failing plane, and brought everyone down safely. And yet she wasn't the center of attention. Her only focus remained the captain, still fighting for life. Hours later, or perhaps minutes, Emily couldn't tell, officials and investigators arrived, cordoning off the plane and assessing the situation. Reporters were already gathering at a distance, cameras flashing, phones recording. News helicopters circled above, capturing the scene from every angle. Emily felt a twinge of nervousness. Her life, so ordinary until today, had just become the story of a lifetime. The first officer turned to her, eyes wide. "You know," he said softly, almost reverently, "pilots spend decades learning to handle emergencies. You just did everything we trained for in a single flight, and you survived." Emily didn't answer immediately. Her mind replayed every moment of the past hours, the turbulence, the failing rudder, the smoke in the cockpit, the roar of the storm, the terrified passengers, and the flickering runway lights. She had faced every nightmare scenario imaginable and survived. But she also knew that the adrenaline, the fear, the sheer responsibility would haunt her for years to come. The captain, now stabilized with oxygen and medical attention, sat up slowly. His eyes were fixed on Emily, gratitude and awe written across his face. "Sparrow," he said again, voice hoarse. "You saved them all. You saved me. I don't even know how to thank you." Emily's throat tightened. I did what I had to do," she whispered. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "You did more than anyone could have expected. You were extraordinary." Outside, the storm had begun to abate, though the rain still fell in heavy sheets. Emergency vehicles moved with precision, guiding passengers to safety and attending to minor injuries. The chaos of the storm and emergency response contrasted sharply with the calm determination that had flowed from Emily in the cockpit. She had been the eye of the hurricane, the single force that had prevented tragedy. The first officer clapped her lightly on the shoulder. "You're going to be famous for this, you know," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Everyone will be talking about the girl who landed Flight 217. Emily shook her head, trying to hide the tears threatening to spill. "I just wanted to get everyone down safely," she said quietly. One of the medics approached. "We need to check you too," he said. Emily nodded, allowing him to examine her, though she felt physically intact. Mentally and emotionally, however, she was exhausted beyond measure. Every thought, every decision, every heartbeat for the past hours had been survival and focus. Now she could finally feel the weight of it. The captain's breathing stabilized fully, and he was helped out of the cockpit by emergency personnel. Emily watched him go, pride and relief mixing in a dizzying rush of emotions. The passengers were being guided off the plane, some embracing, some still trembling, all alive. Every life she had touched in that cockpit was now safe. The first officer stood beside her, quiet for a moment, then said, "I've never seen anything like this. You handled it all. You're remarkable." Emily finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. The tension, the terror, the unimaginable responsibility, all of it began to ebb. She had faced the impossible, navigated a storm, and guided Flight 217 and its passengers to safety. She had earned her place in that cockpit in that moment as a hero. And yet, as the emergency crews continued their work, and the storm clouds thinned on the horizon, Emily knew that the story was far from over. There would be interviews, investigations, awards, recognition. But for now, she simply allowed herself to sit back and feel the weight lift slightly from her shoulders. She had survived. The plane had survived. And for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a flicker of quiet pride. Sparrow, the code name that had once seemed like a childish game, was now a symbol of courage, resilience, and extraordinary bravery. And the world outside, unaware of the extraordinary struggle within the cockpit, was about to learn the story of a 14-year-old girl who had faced a storm, a failing plane, and impossible odds, and had emerged victorious. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because even as emergency crews guided the last passengers to safety, cameras flashing and helicopters hovering, Emily could see the first officer's expression change. Something was coming, someone approaching from the perimeter of the runway, and his face held an urgency she couldn't yet understand. Her heart skipped a beat. The plane had landed. Everyone was safe. But in the world of Flight 217, safe was only the beginning. And the next moment would change everything. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the storm's echoes still rattled Flight 217's fuselage. Emergency crews were busy guiding the last passengers to safety, their voices carrying over the wet tarmac, shouting instructions. Emily Carter sat in the cockpit, still trembling, adrenaline waning, but leaving a residue of exhaustion so deep she felt it in her bones. She had landed a plane, stabilized a failing rudder, managed a storm, and saved hundreds of lives. And yet there was no time to celebrate. Something was coming, something that made her pulse spike again. The first officer, standing beside the cockpit, was staring out toward the perimeter of the airport with an intensity that pulled Emily from her haze of fatigue. His hand pointed subtly. "Look," he said. "Do you see that?" Emily's eyes followed his gesture. At first, she saw nothing but flashing emergency lights and dark silhouettes. Then, almost impossibly, two F-35 fighter jets appeared in the distance, their sleek forms cutting through the thinning clouds, engines roaring like controlled thunder. Their precision was cinematic, descendants of military discipline and technology, and yet they were coming directly for Flight 217. Emily's stomach twisted. What were they doing here? Were they there for her, or was it something worse? A voice crackled over the emergency radio. "Flight 217, this is the Air Force Command. Identify yourself and status of aircraft." Emily swallowed hard, fumbling for the mic. Her voice trembled but was firm. "This is Flight 217. Emergency landing completed. All passengers safe. Plane stabilized. Pilot incapacitated. Emergency taken by Sparrow." There was silence over the radio for a heartbeat. Then a voice, calm but authoritative, spoke. "Sparrow, we've been tracking your flight since departure. Hold your position. F-35 interceptors will escort your aircraft to secure ground. Repeat, hold position." Emily blinked. Sparrow. The code name, whispered by her father years ago as a joke during their simulator drills, was now being recognized by military command. She felt a thrill of disbelief, tinged with terror. Somehow, somewhere, her father's training and her own courage had summoned an acknowledgement from forces far beyond her imagination. The first officer's jaw went slack. "They know your code name?" he asked, awe and incredulity in his voice. "They know you." Emily shook her head, still processing. I don't know, I just did what had to be done." The F-35 streaked closer, precision perfect despite the stormy skies. Their engines screamed, yet the movements were fluid, almost graceful, a ballet of military might. One of the jets positioned itself to the left of Flight 217, the other to the right, forming a protective escort. The pilots' helmets reflected the runway lights, and Emily could see the flash of recognition in one pilot's posture, a subtle acknowledgement that this was no ordinary emergency. The radio crackled again. "Sparrow, we are impressed with your actions. Your control of Flight 217 saved lives under extreme circumstances. Prepare for escort and debrief upon landing. Emergency crews will assist upon arrival." Emily felt her pulse spike again, a mix of pride, disbelief, and residual fear. "Yes," she whispered into the radio. "Understood." She looked at the first officer, who was now grinning despite exhaustion. "Sparrow," he said softly, "you're officially extraordinary. I can't believe a 14-year-old just did what seasoned pilots train decades to achieve." Emily's lips trembled. She wanted to feel triumphant, to celebrate, but she was still in the cockpit, still responsible. The F-35s flanked the plane, perfectly synchronized, their pilot helmets communicating silently, guiding Flight 217 toward a secure section of the runway. Emily followed their lead, adjusting throttle and ailerons as instructed, feeling an almost surreal connection to the planes and pilots around her. She glanced at the passengers moving toward the emergency exits. Their faces were etched with relief, awe, and lingering terror. Some were crying, others were hugging tightly, the magnitude of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Emily's chest ached with the weight of her responsibility. She had saved all of them, but she had also changed the trajectory of her own life forever. The plane rolled steadily toward the designated landing strip, guided now by both her hands and the F-35 escort. Lightning flickered across the sky in the distance, the remnants of the storm still echoing its power. Emily adjusted the rudder as best she could, the plane's left engine now silent, the right engine humming under strain. Sweat and exhaustion blurred her vision, but she pushed forward. "Maintain steady altitude," one of the F-35 pilots instructed over secure channel. "You're doing fine. Approach is clear. Follow our lead." Emily nodded, jaw set. She had landed once already. She could do it again. The runway lights grew larger, guiding her path like a fragile promise in the storm. She felt a surge of confidence, a calm clarity amid the chaos. She was Sparrow. She had become the pilot everyone had relied upon in a moment that could have ended in tragedy. The first officer, still beside her, exhaled. "I don't know how you did it, truly, but you're amazing." Emily didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the runway, hands steadying the plane, balancing throttle and ailerons against wind gusts and residual turbulence. The F-35s guided them like guardians, cutting through the storm with precision that made Flight 217 seem almost fragile by comparison. And then, in an almost cinematic moment, the plane touched down, tires screaming on wet tarmac. Emily adjusted carefully, following the guidance of the F-35s. The plane rolled, gradually decelerating, engines whining under strain. Emergency crews swarmed around the aircraft, guiding passengers to safety. Flashbulbs from cameras lit the rain-soaked runway like stars falling to earth. The first officer let out a long breath, disbelief and awe mingling in his expression. "She landed it. Sparrow, you actually did it." Emily finally allowed herself a small exhale, relief washing through her. She looked at the F-35 pilots, their helmets raised in subtle acknowledgement. Somewhere, through the storm, her father's lessons, her code name, and the hours of preparation had converged into this moment. She had not only saved Flight 217, she had earned recognition from the highest levels of Air Command. Passengers spilled onto the tarmac, some still sobbing, some hugging, all alive. Emily watched quietly, exhausted but proud. Her hands still trembled, but she felt a strange lightness, a sense of something larger than herself. And then, as emergency crews led the captain from the cockpit and passengers filed toward the safe zone, Emily realized the world had changed. She was no longer just a kid in row 9. She was Sparrow, the girl who had guided a failing plane through a storm, faced impossible odds, and emerged as a hero. A reporter approached cautiously, microphone in hand. "Sparrow, Emily Carter, can you tell us what happened?" Emily's lips quivered. She swallowed. I just did what I had to do," she said softly. "Everyone's safe, that's what matters." The F-35 pilots gave a subtle salute, disappearing into the sky as the storm clouds finally broke. Emily watched them go, a surreal sense of awe washing over her. She had survived the storm, the plane had survived, and now she stood at the edge of something extraordinary. And yet, even amid celebration and media attention, Emily felt a quiet sense of responsibility. The adrenaline had faded, but the gravity of her actions remained. Every life she had touched, every decision she had made, would stay with her forever. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of pride, standing in the rain-soaked tarmac, surrounded by emergency crews, passengers, and flashing lights. Sparrow had emerged from the storm, not just alive but triumphant, a hero in the purest sense. But the story wasn't over. The world had noticed, and Emily Carter, the kid from row 9, was about to step into a life forever changed by courage, instinct, and the impossible choices she had made in the cockpit of Flight 217. And the final moment, the moment that would cement her legacy, was still to come. The storm had finally passed. Dawn's first light crept over the horizon, casting soft pinks and golds across the wet tarmac. The chaos of the previous hours, screaming alarms, violent turbulence, flashing lights, smoke curling from the failed engine, was replaced with a fragile calm. Flight 217 sat silent and battered but intact. Emily Carter, still trembling from exhaustion, stepped out of the cockpit, her small frame dwarfed by the aircraft and the emergency crews bustling around her. She felt every muscle ache, every nerve screaming with fatigue, yet a quiet pride surged within her chest. She had survived the impossible, guided the plane through a storm, landed it under catastrophic conditions, and saved over 200 lives. She was just 14 years old, a kid from row 9, but now the word hero followed her like a shadow. Passengers had gathered nearby, blankets draped over shivering shoulders, eyes wide with awe and gratitude. One by one they approached her, tears in their eyes, hands trembling as they shook hers. You saved us," whispered an elderly man, clutching her small hand. "I don't know how you did it, but I owe you my life." Emily swallowed, voice tight. "I just did what I had to do." A young mother hugged her tightly, her infant cradled in one arm. "Our family, we're alive because of you," she said, tears streaking her face. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had expected thanks, applause, recognition, but the raw, unfiltered emotion of the people she had saved was overwhelming in a way she hadn't anticipated. From the corner of her eye, she saw the first officer guiding the captain, now stabilized and breathing steadily, toward the medical team. The man turned, eyes locking on Emily, and gave a faint nod. No words could convey the gratitude and disbelief she saw there. He knew she had carried the impossible burden, and she had done it without hesitation, without question, without fear. Then the sound of supersonic engines cut through the dawn. The F-35s returned, engines roaring like guardian angels arriving for a final acknowledgement. One of the jets descended, landing nearby on the runway, pilots removing helmets to reveal faces of solemn respect. A voice came over a loudspeaker from the Air Force command vehicle. "Emily Carter, code name Sparrow. Your actions today represent extraordinary courage, skill, and composure. On behalf of the United States Air Force and the citizens of this country, we formally recognize you as a national hero." Emily's breath caught. "Me, a national hero," she whispered, disbelief coloring every word. A senior officer approached, hand extended, metal glinting in the early light. "Yes," he said solemnly. "Your actions saved lives, demonstrated composure beyond your years, and set a standard for courage in aviation history. It is my honor to present you with this recognition." The crowd erupted in applause. Passengers cheered, emergency crews saluted, and even the first officer's face glowed with awe. Emily felt the weight of it all, the gratitude, the recognition, the enormity of what she had done, settle on her small shoulders. She accepted the medal with trembling hands, the sunlight glinting off the metal, a symbol of a courage that had carried her through fire, wind, and fear. As the applause continued, she allowed herself a small smile, a rare crack in the armor of composure she had maintained all through the storm. She had done it. Against impossible odds, she had guided Flight 217 and its passengers to safety, handled a failing rudder, landed in a storm, and faced the scrutiny of military command, and survived with grace and courage. Yet even in the triumph, Emily felt a quiet hum of responsibility. The experience had changed her. She was no longer just a kid in row 9. She was Sparrow, the girl who had faced the unimaginable and won. And she knew, deep down, that her life would never return to ordinary. Photographers snapped pictures, capturing the rain-streaked, wind-tangled girl who had become the symbol of extraordinary bravery. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust toward her, but Emily only shook her head. Words felt inadequate to describe the hours of terror, the moments of pure instinct, the fear that had threatened to consume her. She had no story ready for them, only a memory burned into her mind of a storm, a failing plane, and the hundreds of lives she had been entrusted with. The captain approached, now fully supported and breathing steadily. His eyes were full of emotion as he looked at Emily. "Sparrow," he said, voice shaking, "you didn't just save this plane, you saved everyone on board. The crew, the passengers, I owe you everything." Emily felt a lump in her throat. I just did what I had to," she repeated softly, though she knew the weight of those words had never been heavier or more true. The Air Force officers motioned for her to follow. They led her toward a helicopter that had landed nearby, a formal escort to a debriefing location and national recognition ceremony. Emily climbed in, her body aching, mind racing, heart pounding from exhaustion and awe. She looked down at Flight 217 one last time, the storm clouds lifting behind it, sunlight glinting off the fuselage, and felt an overwhelming sense of closure. She had faced the impossible, and she had triumphed. As the helicopter lifted off, Emily glanced out the window. Emergency crews were still guiding the last passengers, passengers waving, reporters shouting. The F-35s flew in tight formation beside her, their presence a final salute, a reminder of the recognition she had earned and the extraordinary journey she had undertaken. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine her father watching, a faint smile on his face, proud beyond measure. He had trained her, prepared her, instilled in her the skills that had made this impossible landing possible. And in that fleeting moment of thought, Emily felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had honored everything he had taught her. The helicopter rose into the sky, leaving the storm and Flight 217 behind. Emily leaned back, breathing slowly, allowing the tension and fear to finally ebb. She had faced death, chaos, and impossible odds, and survived. She had become something more than a passenger, more than a child. She had become a hero. In the distance, the city began to wake, unaware of the drama that had unfolded above them just hours before. But those who had witnessed it, emergency crews, passengers, the first officer, the captain, and the Air Force, would never forget. And Emily Carter would carry the memory, the lesson, and the code name Sparrow forever. As the helicopter banked and turned toward the ceremony awaiting her, Emily whispered to herself, voice steady despite exhaustion, "I did it. I really did it." And the world, slowly learning the story of Flight 217, would soon know too. Because this was no longer just a story of survival. It was a story of courage, instinct, and extraordinary heroism. And Emily Carter, just a kid from Row 9, had written herself into history.